It's good to have you in class tonight, everyone. This is our 41st lesson. I've added some material to the book. I decided to go through some websites that where atheists and skeptics and probably some old Earth creationists have argued against a flood. Some of them admit there was a flood, but argue it was a local flood, and others are just outright atheists. I've not made any distinction between them. I believe they're all wrong in their interpretation. We'll be showing some flaws in their reasoning and factual flaws as well as logical reasoning, logical errors in their reasoning in this study. If I have the time, I'll do a couple of more of these links, these websites, and deal with them as well. So we'll try to deal with them. I think it's important because this is something that can destroy people's faith. Let's look at questions about the flood. We're going to discuss some more of the questions. Last week we had questions about the flood. Some arguments against the universal flood by a man named Lawrence G. Collins. He's a retired geology professor from California. And we'll give a link here. And I think that's Cal State University at Northridge, I think it is, but you can go to this link and find the information. And he cites a series of studies from other sources, but he makes various claims. We'll look at some of them. We're not going to look at every single claim. Some of his claims we've already answered, and some we'll answer at a later time. Lawrence G. Collins on page 2 of this article, and the link here is the link you have on the screen right now that we're citing. Page 2, he wrote the following. Salt and gypsum deposits more than 200 feet thick occur in the Paradox Formation in Utah, just 200 miles north of the Grand Canyon. These deposits are the same age as the Supai rocks in the Grand Canyon that are supposedly also deposited by Noah's flood. Now, I want you to notice something here. He argues that these are the same age. Now, how did he date them? The question is, he has made the claim they're the same age, and then he's argued from that claim. He hasn't established that claim. We'll be dealing with the age of the earth in later studies, and we'll be dealing with that more thoroughly. But right here, we have gypsum and salt being deposited, and more than 200 feet thick of salt and gypsum in the Paradox Formation. Now, he's arguing this, that these similar salt deposits up to 3,000 feet thick exist in various parts on all continents and in layers of all geologic ages. I doubt that he can prove it's on all continents. I think that's probably he stepped out where he doesn't have evidence, because I doubt that they have drilled into Antarctica. It's one of the continents. But we'll just leave that point alone. Again, making a broad sweeping claim there. And have they drilled that deep and found 3,000 feet of thick deposits in all the continents and in layers of all geologic ages? Now, remember, the geologic ages are all dated and age given as an assumption based upon uniformitarian geology, which has been rejected. We'll be showing how he resorts back to uniformitarian geology in a lot of his argumentation. And these deposits can only be produced by evaporation of seawater. Now, that's a broad sweeping change, because he's made an assumption that there's only one way. Now, we know evaporation could produce it, but are there other phenomena that could have produced it? Now, whenever you make something that this is the only way that it can be done, then you assume then that you have tested all possible explanations for this deposit occurring. And of course, they haven't done that. And of course, he's not being very scientific in this regard. He says such evaporation could not have happened in repeated intervals in the midst of 40 days and 40 nights of raining and during the supposed continuous deposition of sedimentary rocks by a worldwide flood which the only drying and evaporation is said to have occurred at the end of the flood. And again, he has taken 40 days and 40 nights of rain as the only cause of the flood. So he has not even considered my flood model whatsoever. He has not dealt with the proper flood model and the 150 days breaking of the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven as well, and the winds that occurred during the flood due to tidal action. Remember, wind tides occur right now from the moon about 1/20th of a mile per hour. And if the planet Mercury came close to the Earth, as my model claims it did, it would have produced winds of well over 150, 200 mile per hour. And so, and it would have been doing this for 150 days. After the 40 days or nights of rain pretty well ceased, there might have been intermittent rain occurring, but the bulk of the rain had occurred, taking out the water vapor canopy. Now, of course, what this did, the canopy being removed, it changed the barometric pressure and changed the solutions of various minerals in the water itself. The water will have precipitating chemicals coming out of it due to the change of barometric pressure. Now, Collins did not use the flood model that I set forth earlier in this volume. He obviously dated the rocks by uniformitarian geologic assumptions when he wrote, "These deposits are the same age of the Supai rocks of the Grand Canyon." There was time for drying with the winds that occurred during the times between the various tidal inflows and the outflows. So we have tidal flows in and out and winds occurring at this time, and we could have drying effects occurring during that time. That certainly could have occurred. Now, the basic argument of Collins is a logical fallacy, however. He commits this logical fallacy. His first premise is, if a Christian can explain how gypsum, salt, etc., were deposited by the flood, then there's an explanation for the flood from the flood for this deposition. Well, if a Christian can explain it, then there is an explanation. Well, that's certainly true. We would agree with that. And he argues that a Christian cannot explain how gypsum, salt, etc., were deposited by the flood. Well, there are certainly a possibility that they might not be able to find anybody that could explain it. That's the possibility. Let's just assume that he's correct in that point. That would not necessarily prove his conclusion that there is not an explanation for the flood for this deposition. Why? Because the argument itself has a form of if-then, a conditional or hypothetical syllogism. And what we have, if the Christian can explain how gypsum, salt, etc., were deposited by the flood, that's your antecedent, A-N-T-E-C-E-D, antecedent. But what he has done is committed the logical fallacy. His second premise denies the antecedent, and that is a logical fallacy. It proves nothing. This conclusion proves nothing. Now, this conclusion would be correct if indeed it was a biconditional, which is not. But also, denying the antecedent is not a fallacy if you have a biconditional, logical biconditional. But this is not a biconditional. Now, what we have here is, if God couldn't explain it, an omniscient being, then there is no explanation. But I'm not omniscient, and no Christian is omniscient. So again, his argument, he purports to crows and purports to have proven his case, but he hasn't proven a thing by the argument. The argument itself is flawed. It contains a logical fallacy. It would not be a fallacy if an omniscient being could not explain it. If one knew everything there is possible to know, and he couldn't explain it, then there wouldn't be an explanation. But I'm not an omniscient being, and no human is an omniscient being. So again, what we have here is we have over and over repeatedly the atheists committing logical fallacies. Now, this man, Collins, he spends a fair amount of time in this treatise chiding creationists, people who believe in creation, and particularly biblical creationists. He spends a great deal of time chiding them for not being reasonable in their approach to science. One of the arguments, and he argues that they should experiment, and we'll see this, and they should prove their hypotheses. But the problem with it is he makes an hypothesis and his logic is flawed. One of the most important things a scientist must do, he must use correct reasoning from his hypotheses, and the conclusions must be derived from correct reasoning. And the problem is he has not employed correct reasoning. Very simple, very elementary logical fallacy he committed, denying the antecedent. And so he committed this simple, elementary logical fallacy. His argument, therefore, is sophomoric. It is definitely proves nothing. Since it contains a logical fallacy, it does not prove that there is no explanation for the flood from the flood model. There might be an explanation we haven't come up with yet or found, or seen, or even learned about from a science, even from science. The changes in the barometric pressure during the flood might have precipitated out the minerals, that is gypsum salt, from the seawater, from the water itself. And this certainly can happen. This change in barometric pressure would remove certainly gases, definitely would, and we would see this from Henry's law. But other chemicals could also precipitate out from basically the same principle. Now, what I'm saying is, his consideration of the model, he didn't consider the model that I postulated or hypothesized. On page 2, Collins wrote also, sand dunes with giant cross-bedding occur in the Mesozoic rocks of the Zion National Park. Now that's near the Grand Canyon, and are further evidence that desert conditions occurred at the time of the supposed flood. So desert conditions occurred during the time of the supposed flood, he says. So he argues then that the flood could not have occurred because they would have had been desert conditions. And of course, he reasons that there was only 40 days of rain. He reasons, he totally neglects the possibility of a tidal flood, in which there were inflows and outflows of water, where the water would have run off the surface. And if we had winds upwards of 150, 200 miles per hour, these winds definitely could have dried out and the surface and caused sand dunes to occur. They might not have been that high winds, but wind certainly could have reached upwards close to 200 miles per hour under some conditions. So the model that I've set forth actually allows for sand dunes to have been occurred or created during the flood. The sand dunes could have occurred, and the tides come back in and overflowed them and covered them up. And there could have been even more sand dunes put on top of them. So my model would actually explain how these sand dunes were actually deposited and how they were created. He doesn't consider the Fox flood model that has tidal actions and winds during the flood. So he doesn't touch my model whatsoever. He doesn't have any, his arguments have no effect upon my model. They do not do any damage to my model. After the 40 days of rain ceased, the winds continued and produced sand dunes at low tides. As the tides shifted from in and outward tides, then this would occur. Collins argued also for mud cracks not being consistent with the flood model that he considered in pages 2 and 3 of his treatise. The problem is that my flood model explains the mud cracks on the same basis or a similar basis to how it explains sand dunes. The tides moved in and out, and the winds could have dried it out very quickly. And then after the 40 days of rainfall, and the winds then could have dried it out and then formed mud. And whenever the tides came back, it could have very easily covered that mud up with other sedimentary rock, which was then formed. So again, my flood model he has no problem with this mudstone, mud cracks. Raindrop prints occur in many places around the world, which could not have been formed or preserved if the muds and shales containing these prints were deposited underwater during Noah's flood. So he assumes that the water covered it, and of course that would not allow raindrops to occur. I can see his reasoning, but the problem is he's not considered my flood model. The tidal action, where the waters would flow in and out and be uncovered, the rain could have created in the soft material, and then the rain could have pelted it, and then could have been covered up with more sediment after the tide then reversed direction. And so this could have covered it up. So we could have had raindrop prints all around the world during this time. So my flood model certainly allows for it and would explain how it could occur, because the tides would flow in and out. And we've already seen that in 2 Peter and some other passages, it appears to use the world was overflowed with water. And so we see the coming and going of the water, and tidal action would fit quite well. I believe my model, the Fox flood model, is consistent with raindrop prints in the rocks. Therefore, his argument has been answered. Again, we would point out, both of these, the mudstone and the sand dunes and the raindrop prints, he's saying in his basic argument, and we haven't set it forth here, he's basically arguing if Fox can explain the sand dunes, his model can explain the sand dunes, then there's an explanation. And he then claims that Fox cannot explain it, and therefore there's no explanation. Of course, that commits the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. But in fact, I think I have explained it with my model and shown that my model is consistent with these three phenomena. But suppose that he were to falsify or show that my model won't explain it, he still has committed this logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. And all three of his arguments, therefore, are flawed. But I believe my model explains it, and therefore I did not set forth the logical fallacy. But it's still a logical fallacy. His whole line of reasoning is all three of these are committed logical fallacies. He argues further that nests of dinosaur eggs on page 3 of this treatise are found in several places around the world, and it is illogical that dinosaurs would have enough time to create these nests and lay their eggs while they were fleeing from rising waters to reach higher ground. Now that's a pretty bad grope in his reasoning here. It's pretty weak. First of all, the dinosaur eggs could have been laid, and this could have been covered pretty quickly. Of course, the tidal flood would have covered it very quickly. So these dinosaur nests could have been covered quickly due to the floodwaters coming in from the oceans, from the fountains of the deep. And so what we see here then is they fleeing from the rising waters. The waters could have risen very quickly, not like rainfall causing it. And so he has basically assumed that 40 days of rainfall is the only causal factor for the flood. And he has not even touched in any shape, form, or fashion the Fox flood model whatsoever. But again, he's committed the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent, because he's saying if a Christian X can explain the dinosaur eggs, how they're found, then there's an explanation. Then he said they can't explain it. And of course, then there's no explanation. That's his basic reasoning. And it's a logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. And I've found over and over that these atheists, agnostics, and even many old earth creationists are irrational in their thinking and in their reasoning. And so again, we just need a good study in logic, and we can see how flawed their reasoning is. And so we need a study in logic. That's what we need. Hopefully I'll be able to start a study in our school next year. Collins does not consider that a tidal flood, and his arguments are based upon false assumptions, and they contain the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. He assumes the waters rose slowly, but tidal actions would have been fairly rapid. Furthermore, he commits the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. Now, Collins wrote, the White Cliffs of Dover on the eastern coast of England consist of chalk layers up to more than 350 feet thick that are composed of fossilized coccoliths, a type of algae. And these layers are the same age as the sedimentary rocks that overlie giant cross-bedded sandstones in Zion National Park. And therefore, they were supposedly also deposited by Noah's flood. Of course, he has made the assumptions, the age, they're the same age as these other rocks. He's probably dated it by index fossils, and that's based upon uniformitarian geologic assumptions. And again, he probably is going to have trouble accepting all of the premises of uniformitarian geologic assumptions. But again, he has argued this, and he's argued 350 feet thick they are, and probably they are. I would have no doubt about that, and they are fossilized coccoliths, no doubt about that. And as far as being the same age, they're pretty close to the same age because the flood occurred over a period of 1 year, 150 days, like about a year's time. Now, let's look at this a little more carefully, however. Let's think about this. He goes on and tells us further, but coccoliths are very tiny and have chloroplasts that require sunlight and must float close to the ocean's surface to get energy from the sun. Well, I would agree with that. Because of this fact, all of them could not have been living at the same time in depths of 300 feet in the 1 year in which the flood was said to have occurred, because of many organisms in the water at the same time would have blocked out the sun from organisms below the near surface. And of course, his reasoning is good there. But the problem is, we don't have these organisms and this layer, the White Cliffs of Dover type layer. We don't have it all over the world. A tidal flood, remember, tides rotate, and they go in a rotating form. And these organisms could have been all over the ocean and could have become concentrated in certain areas due to the spinning motion of the tides. And in this case, they could have been sorted out by forces, like a centrifuge. A rotating centrifuge can separate things out. I remember as a boy, we didn't have electricity until I was about 9 or 10 years old. So I grew up on the ranch with no electricity, no indoor plumbing, and no radio and TV. We had a radio, but it was run by a wind charger and a battery. It was charged up. But that's all we had. We didn't have a telephone. But so we would milk cows, and we would take the milk, the whole milk, and we'd spin it in a rotating centrifuge. And we would rotate it, but you had to, didn't have electricity to turn it, so you had to turn it by hand. So I was a boy, 8 or 9, 10 years old, and I would have to turn this thing at a certain speed, and it would separate the cream from the whole milk, and it would separate the cream out. And we could make butter out of the cream, and we could sell the cream. And the whole milk was then separated, the cream was separated out. Well, this is a centrifuge, the spinning motion that can separate out the heavier from the lighter elements, or the lighter materials. And a tidal action will accomplish the same result. And so I would argue then that the tides could have separated these organisms so that some regions like the Dover could have had these thick layers of it. Other places wouldn't have hardly any. And so that's exactly, I believe, what we see here. And a tidal flood would explain it. But again, he commits this logical fallacy of assuming my flood model is consistent with it due to spinning motions. And actions would sort these creatures and deposit them in certain locations. But again, he makes the logical assumption if Marian can explain it, or if Christian X can explain it, then there's an explanation, and that's certainly true. But he says Christian X cannot explain it, and of course I believe I have. But he argues that they can't explain it, therefore there is no explanation. Again, that commits the same logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. But this is a very common fallacy committed by atheists. They commit this fallacy over and over and over again. And it's very, very disconcerting to me to see men with PhD degrees that cannot reason properly. So I find it to be very disappointing, and it's disconcerting. Collins further wrote on page 6, none of the sedimentary rocks in the Grand Canyon contain fossilized pollen grains that are produced by grasses, pines, and flowering trees and plants, whereas these same rocks in the canyon contain only spores of algae, ferns, moss, and fungi. Now, let me point out here, we're going to show evidence that grasses existed during the times of the dinosaurs. And their claim is that the grasses evolved much, much later. But fossilized dinosaur dung has proven that they were eating grasses. So grasses did exist. So we know these fossilized pollens from grasses should have been there if this was uniformity in geology was true. And so the problem is that if you don't find them, that doesn't mean they're not there. So our problem is he's committed another logical fallacy. We'll show it, but I do have evidence that we'll show that later of fossilized dinosaur dung that existed, and the dinosaurs were supposed to have died out before grasses evolved. And of course, they had to change the whole setup with this. And again, of course, the fact that they can't find these or haven't found them, and I understand that there's claims that they have found them now, claims that they haven't found them doesn't prove a thing. Because basically his argument is, he goes on and says, and I'll argue back with it in just a moment, a worldwide flood would be expected to mix these tiny structures if all were alive at the same time of Noah's flood. This mixing did not occur. How can a rush of water in a tsunami sort out and separate such tiny reproductive structures from each other? Now, tiny reproductive, he means spores and of course, what we find here, the spores and pollen, grains of pollen and so forth. Now, what we have here then is, I want to digress just one quick moment here. He talks about, he uses the term tsunami, sort out. And I don't know of any flood models or the major flood models, and Wipton Morris and others, who use the term tsunami. Although I think there is evidence that tsunamis did occur during the flood. But he, again, uses terminology to prejudice, perhaps to prejudice his audience. But nonetheless, here, he argues that these he can't find these. And so here again, he did not consider the Fox flood model. His argument is, and let's look at it now, if we have found certain fossilized pollen grains, then the plants from which these pollens were derived existed during the time of the deposition of the rocks. Well, he argues we have not found certain fossilized pollen grains. Therefore, the plants from which these pollens were derived did not exist during the time of the deposition of the rocks. The problem is, during the time of the dinosaurs now, fossilized dinosaur dung has proven that grasses existed during that time. And so here is second premise, even though they haven't found it, let's assume they haven't found it, but I understand that there's some evidence that they did exist in these rocks. But his argument then is denying the antecedent. Because if you look at the antecedent, we have found certain fossilized pollen grains. And his claim is we have not found certain fossilized pollen. It denies the antecedent. And of course, the conclusion is that the plants from which these pollens were derived did not exist. Well, we can prove they existed by that fossilized dinosaur dung. So we've disproven his conclusion. But his conclusion is not proven by the argument, because even though the first one is true, the first premise is definitely true. The second is argumentative. It's debatable as to whether it actually is true. But let's just give him the point that it is true, just for the sake of argument, only for the sake of argument. And we have not found certain fossilized pollen grains. I think that there's some evidence now that they found some. But even if we don't have that evidence, this denial of the antecedent is a logical fallacy. And again, if he's a good scientist, he would use good reasoning, and he's not using good reasoning. His argument denies the antecedent. And of course, his conclusion is totally not established. It's completely false. That is, he cannot argue that the conclusion is true based upon this argument. And he has not proven his case. And of course, I disproved his conclusion by dinosaur dung that has been found, fossilized dinosaur dung that has grass in it. And so his conclusion has been falsified by the dinosaur dung. And first of all, his conclusion could not be derived from this argument, because the argument is fallacious. It contains a logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. So I've disproven it, but the argument wouldn't have proven anything anyhow, because it's irrational. It's unsound. It is not a sound argument. It commits a logical fallacy. Commits the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. He fails to acknowledge that the scientists have not even examined an infinitesimal part of the rocks. Just examining a few rocks, and they can't find the pollen grains. And pollen grains are very small. And he then argues, we haven't found it. We've examined a few of the rocks, and we haven't found it. Therefore, it's not there. Well, for crying out loud, you'd have to examine large samples of the rocks, because he's extrapolating. We've examined a certain small, very infinitesimal part of the rocks, and we didn't find any pollen. Therefore, it's not there in the other rocks. But that's certainly a bad reasoning. And so, if we have found it in these rocks, then it will be in other rocks. We have not found it in this rock, therefore it's not in other rocks. Again, his basic argument here is, if we have found it in the rocks we've examined, then it will be in the other rocks. We have not found it in the rocks we've examined. Again, this argument overall commits another logical fallacy of denying the antecedent. And his reasoning is fallacious. And again, I'm not surprised, because atheists don't reason well. And his argument basically is flawed for that reason. On page 7, he argues abundant fusan, or charcoal, is found in several different sedimentary rocks around the world that was supposedly deposited by Noah's flood, which is good evidence that a worldwide flood never occurred. And of course, this sounds good to people, because he argues fires that burn forests are not likely to occur in the midst of 40 days and 40 nights of rain. Of course, the problem is it only rained 40 days and 40 nights. And we have other information that we'll be dealing with in a later study in this series. We will be showing evidence of fires during the flood, at the end of the flood, after the 40 days of rain. We'll show evidence that fires occurred. And so my model actually has fires occurring in it. So again, he takes the model of only 40 days of rainfall, 40 days and nights, 40 nights. He does not look at the Bible carefully. He does not examine it carefully. He has not considered the Fox flood model whatsoever, in any way, shape, form, or fashion. So my model actually explains how fires occurred, and will have fires occurring during the flood, toward the end of the flood, certainly not during the rainfall. This charcoal will be dealt with in a later section of this volume, and we will deal with it later. But we'll come to that. It's already in the treatise in my volume. In his attacks upon the Whitcomb-Morris flood model, he misrepresents this model with his claims that it amounts to a tsunami. Now, one of the first books I bought was Whitcomb-Morris's book many years ago when I was very young. And I believe it's very helpful, and I would recommend the purchase of that book, although I don't adhere totally to his flood model. He has a lot of good information in the book. I don't believe his model is totally correct, however. But much of what he has, a vast majority of that material is good material. And it's well worth the time to study it and read it. So I definitely recommend you purchase the book and study it, because I believe it's very, very good material. But his model, the Whitcomb-Morris flood model, their flood model, I believe, is flawed. I don't believe they've taken into account all of the information that I've had in my model. Now, my model may have flaws in it too. Someone else later may improve upon it, and I hope they do. If there's something I've left out, I hope someone else takes it and goes with it. It's a model, and it certainly can have flaws in it. I would argue that. He's either ignorant of the model, so he has misrepresented Whitcomb-Morris's model. I believe actually it misrepresents him, and so he claims that it amounts to a tsunami. And of course, their model doesn't amount to a tsunami. It's not the same thing. Therefore, he's either ignorant of the model, the Whitcomb-Morris model. This makes him to be unqualified to critique it, or he is dishonest and is misrepresenting their model, in which case it makes him unworthy of critiquing it. Either he's unqualified or he's unworthy of critiquing their model. Again, I'm not defending their model, but their model is a very good model, and it was certainly set me on the road to studying. And I believe it's excellent material, and I would recommend you purchase that book. And again, I think the followers that have taken after Whitcomb and Morris have failed to even consider the possibility that Whitcomb-Morris might have been incomplete in their argumentation. I think that's one of the flaws that these men have that have followed after Whitcomb and Morris. Collins also on page 8 wrote, coarsely crystalline Zoroaster granite occurs in the Vishnu schist in the bottom of the Grand Canyon. Next slide. Some of his sentences are very long, and so I tried to get a whole sentence on a slide. Experimental work shows that coarse crystals in granite are formed only at the depths of 5 miles or more in the Earth's crust, and that at these depths, the rate of cooling of rock melts magma at temperatures of more than 800 degrees Celsius require at least 5 million years before temperatures are low enough the crystal can start to form and slowly increase in size. I want you to notice something, how irrational and crazy his statement is. Experimental work shows. Now, I want you to tell me, did they could have put it under the pressure they would have had at that depth, and they could have heated it up to this temperature that they expect the rocks to have at that depth. So that could have been done in a laboratory, all right? I would agree that that could all have occurred, but it requires at least 5 million years. Now, there's the rub. They did not have 5 million years of laboratory work, experimental work, to examine how this formed. Okay. Now, again, they may be projecting, based upon uniformitarian assumptions, that this would have cooled off. The time to cool it would have taken 5 million years at the rate of the movement of temperature due to heat flow. But again, they certainly didn't experiment with it over a 5 million year period of time. That's absurd. They certainly didn't do that. They don't even believe that humans have existed for 5 million years. They think we evolved later than 5 million years ago, but in approximately that time frame. Now, again, And therefore, the age of the Earth must be more than 6,000 years, much older than when Noah's flood supposedly occurred. Now, watch what they've done. He's argued it took this period of time for this to occur. Based upon what? What assumption? Based on the assumption of uniformitarian geology. Again, he's gone right back to uniformitarianism. And he's got all the flaws of a uniformitarianism in his reasoning. He has rejected catastrophism entirely with this claim. He's basically arguing nothing catastrophic could have caused this. Again, he repeatedly challenged theists with claims that they should verify their hypotheses by experiments, and he does, and then he turns right around and he hasn't verified it with a 5 million year experiment. It hasn't occurred. He has extrapolated based upon his assumption of what happened. So it's based upon assumptions, not upon an experiment. It is not based upon experiment. They didn't have 5 million years of time for this to solidify and to cool off. They just didn't have it. They modeled it with computer, and they took some readings. They may have put it under the pressures they would have had, and that certainly could have been done. And they may have raised its temperature up. But then to assume that it was that deep and that this rock has moved. Now, again, they have another problem that we'll be looking at later. How in the world did these heavy rocks get elevated? How did the mountain ranges get elevated? They have no explanation for it. Again, I would argue that the lack of explanation doesn't prove there's not one. I won't commit that logical fallacy. But it certainly shows that they have a problem with their system. And it's, I believe, an insurmountable problem. But this claim was not verified by experimentation, experiment requiring 5 million years. He assumed that these rocks were not formed at creation. First of all, that's an assumption. And they could have been formed at creation. Now, Collins repeatedly resorts to uniformitarian assumptions in his argumentation, including this argumentation here. And of course, he commits the logical fallacy of denying the antecedent as well. On page 8, he continued the rate of erosion of the Zoroaster granite in the floor of Colorado River in Grand Canyon, as measured by how fast the erosion occurs on a yearly basis from year to year, is about 1,000th of an inch per year. Now, what's the assumption here? The assumption is Colorado River has cut that Grand Canyon, and it cuts it 1,000th of an inch per year. So they extrapolate backwards in time. That assumes then that river cut the Grand Canyon, and that it has had the same basic flow rate that it has now, and that flow rate has cut that Grand Canyon. And of course, that's an assumption. And so the rate of erosion that is extrapolated back in time using linear extrapolation, assuming a constant rate, that's uniformitarianism. It's uniformitarianism. Again, he has gone right back to it. And I warned you in the first 2 or 3 lessons that they would do this. That's exactly what we see them doing. This means that the carving of the Grand Canyon took millions of years. That I'm continuing to quote Collins, not in less than a year, in a sudden rush of water draining from the lakes, from 3 lakes at the end of Noah's flood. Now, he's arguing that it wasn't caused by lakes that overflowed. This is a new theory that's come out, and there's some evidence to support it. And we'll be arguing for this in just a moment. Collins might be referring to the Grand Canyon spillover theory, as it's called, that supposedly cut the canyon. The Grand Canyon spillover theory has like bit of Hochi causing the Grand Canyon and maybe some other lakes. But let me point out here, this theory has come about in the recent 15 or 20 years. And it is a new theory, and I believe it probably is true. No doubt Collins resorts to uniformitarian assumptions to argue against this theory. And again, he argues against it with uniformitarianism because this lake spillover theory would be catastrophic. and it would be cut quickly. Already established that waters of a river that are running slowly cut almost nothing. They do almost no cutting through the rocks. But if there's a flood, a river floods, it may cut a rock through the rocks 10 or 15 feet in 1 year due to flooding action. And of course, this spillover theory, as we'll lay it out more clearly here, will be very, it would cut very rapidly. Yeah, definitely, I believe this spillover theory probably is the correct explanation. Scientific observations and measurements show that the Grand Canyon, the canyon of the Colorado River, was eroded by rates of 80 to 450 meters per million years at different places along the canyon. So that's the rate at which it was cut, according to Collins. And again, it's uniformitarian geology. Slow, gradual, constant rates. Of course, neither Collins nor any other scientist made any scientific observations that lasted for the millions of years for this cutting of this channel of the Grand Canyon. And so he has no observational evidence. He's just extrapolated backwards with his uniformitarian assumptions. And so again, he's not being scientific. They simply made uniformitarian assumptions and extrapolated these assumptions back in time. That's all he's done. Also wrote, an experiment is done by Charles Monroe III, an engineer, that shows that the submergence of an olive tree underwater for more than 3 months kills the tree. On that basis, when a dove brought an olive twig with fresh branches to Noah on the ark, the whole world cannot have been submerged underwater during that flood. Otherwise, all olive trees would have been killed in 6 months of their submergence under the floodwaters. Now, therefore, the flood must have been local in southern Mesopotamia, with some land, say 100 feet above water, was present, in which olive trees might have been growing, and from which an olive branch with such a twig with fresh leaves could have been obtained by the dove. So here, he may be an old earth creationist, but he's probably an atheist. But he is allowed for a flood, a local flood, to have occurred. And his argument it could have been a local flood. Now in Genesis 8, verse 10 and 11, and he stayed yet other 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came in to him at eventide, and lo, in her mouth was an olive leaf plucked off. So Noah knew that the waters were abated from off the earth. That's what he's referring to in Genesis 8, verse 11. Collins implicitly admits that there was a flood. He just assumes it would be a local flood. This is an interesting admission by an atheist. And so he does make that admission. There's no doubt that an olive tree was floating on the water and stuck in the soil, and the water decreased as the water decreased. So very easily could have happened that way. And olive trees you can stick a branch into the ground, it'll take root. That's what we learned. Monroe's experiment does not replicate the flood conditions of any flood model that I know of. He just made an assumption on it, that it would have been covered up by water. And of course, the wood could have been floating. It could have been debris floating, and these pieces of the tree could have survived. Sedimentary rocks in the Grand Canyon were all deposited by Noah's worldwide flood, and these rocks have been deposited in less than 1 year underwater and show continuous deposition from one formation to the next up the canyon walls without disruption. This is not the case. Now, watch what he says. For example, the Red Wall Limestone Formation has ancient karst topography with caves and sinkholes, indicating that the formation was once lifted out of the water, so that percolating rainwater could dissolve out cavities and tunnels in limestone. And erosion channels of the Temple Butte Formation, as much as 100 feet deep, cut the top of the Mauve limestone and networks of channels of the Surprise Canyon Formation. up to 1.5 mile wide and 400 feet deep. Got the top of the Redwall limestone, indicating that these rocks were exposed at the Earth's surface to river erosion. These structural land surface features would take much more than 1 year to be formed. Now, there's no problem with these objections with the Fox flood model because it hypothesized a tidal flood. This would answer these objections. I believe a tidal flood would answer them. And of course, he is arguing basically for a method of forming out these caves, caverns and caves, based upon assumptions of probably of assumptions of one different acid to form it. I'll get back with this in our next lesson and give you a reference to a treatise that's been set forth that answers the possibilities of this being cut very quickly, not very slowly. Sulfuric acid being the cause of it, which would cut it very quickly. The flood model, the Fox flood model, has the Grand Canyon being cut by a fluvial lake or by several fluvial lakes after the flood. Now, we've already, in this series of studies, we've studied Lake Bonneville, and of course, we've studied the glacial lake in Montana that overflowed and cut out a large region of eastern Washington, the Scablands. And so we've seen this occur, and we've seen other evidence. But Lake Bonneville, when it overflowed and flowed over, cut a deep channel. The Snake River was cut. The channel for the Snake River was cut. That's a pretty deep channel. And it cut this in a short period of time, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 years. It overflowed very rapidly. And so that's a fluvial lake. I believe after the flood, there were regions where water was trapped on the land with the uplifting. And then this water, as the rainfall occurred, it continued to rise, and eventually it began to overflow, and it cut these channels, these fluvial lakes, after the flood occurred. Now, let me point out here, this lake, we'll go back to it. One of the lakes I want you to see. Grand Canyon spillover theory. We'll come back to that spillover theory next week a little bit, and I will give you more information about that. But there's a link or two, and you can do a research on this Grand Canyon spillover theory. This lake is, there's evidence the lake existed. There's no doubt it existed. And it was in Arizona and probably over into parts of Utah. And the lake was larger than Lake Michigan. And it held a fantastic amount of water. And this lake then flowed through the Grand Canyon. And it at one time, the lake then flowed through Grand Canyon. A lake that size pouring out through the Grand Canyon would cut that canyon very quickly. But there appears to be 2 other lakes that are also maybe overflowing about the same time. And this overflowing, these lakes began to overflow. And when they did, they cut the Grand Canyon very quickly. I believe that Betahochie was the main lake, but there were 2 other smaller lakes. And that's why Collins refers to 3 lakes. Let's go back to his reference here, not in less than a year. And he says, he assumes that these rocks were created, but one of the references he referred to 3 lakes, and he's dealing with this response. This is a new response, a new idea about how the Grand Canyon was formed, and it rejects uniformitarian geology. So be aware of this. I'm convinced that this is probably the correct explanation for it. Much like we have Lake Bonneville overflowing, and these will be fluvial lakes. This concludes our study for today. I realize I've jumped around a bit, but I hope this has been very helpful to you. I'll try to deal with this next week and get some more information, and I'll get some more information about the spillover theory and give you some links to that as well.